Section 4 of Catholic and Anti-Catholic History by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Second-hand History by James J. Walsh. There is a prejudice against second-hand goods which the high cost of living has not lessened. The bother is that they are never as dependable as we hoped they would be. If people would only take that lesson to heart with regard to second-hand authorities and second-hand opinions as well as second-hand goods, the acquisition of real knowledge would be a simpler matter. Talk about a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. It is nothing in riskiness to thinking that you know things when you do not. American editors are particularly prone to be confident in their assertions of knowledge that is dubious at best, but the flagrant example cocksureness with regard to things that are not so is Mr. Arthur Brisbane. What a lot of second-hand authorities on all sorts of subjects he has read, and what a lot of them have proved to be quite as undependable as second-hand things generally are. He is advertised as the highest-paid editorial writer in the country. He ought to be able to get hold of some new first-hand authors. His editorials are a veritable joke book in their absolute assurance of expression just where the mysteries of things are the deepest. Lord Bryce's warning that in spite of all our advance in science, the mists that hang round man's origin and man's destiny are just as deep as they ever were, has no meaning apparently for Mr. Brisbane. He knows all about them. He is still in the silly 70s, as they are well called, that period a decade or so after the publication of Darwin's book, when a number of shallow scientists thought that evolution was just going to explain everything. Occasionally Brisbane wanders into history. When he does so, he is the greatest displayer of second-hand opinions left among us at the present time. That is, of those who pretend to have any knowledge. History lies have proved such dangerous bombs to handle that most editors are somewhat careful in their historical authorities. But apparently Mr. Brisbane does not take it amiss that a historian is a little more than a generation behind the age. He has been accustomed to such hand-me-down opinions for so long that presumably he is not waked up yet to the fact that historical fashions have changed very much, especially in the 20th century. He seems to have read some books about 40 years ago, and in spite of his constant preachment with regard to the wonderful progress of mankind, to have forgotten that history is very different now from what it used to be. The Cambridge Modern History at the beginning of the present century suggested that great additions have of late been made to our knowledge of the past. The long conspiracy against the revelation of truth has gradually given way, and competing historians all over the civilized world have been zealous to take advantage of the change. The printing of archives has kept pace with the admission of inquirers, and the total mass of new matter which the last half-century has accumulated amounts to many thousands of volumes. In view of changes and of gains such as these, it has become impossible for the historical writer of the present age to trust without reserve even to the most respected secondary authorities. No wonder that the editors of the Cambridge Modern History emphatically insist that the honest student finds himself continually deserted, retarded, misled by the classics of historical literature. If that is true for the classics, what must be his wanderings consequent on dependence upon chance contributors to history who had theses to prove and collected only the material they thought would prove them? I picked up a Boston paper the other day and found that Brisbane was still reading and recommending others to read such works as The Intellectual Development of Europe by Dr. John W. Draper and Dr. Andrew D. White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. The amusing thing for me about Professor Draper's book is that while he was teaching and acting as attending physician at Bellevue Hospital, that hospital was a veritable disgrace to civilization. Its death rate was woefully high, it was almost unbelievably dirty, and its nurses, as Stephen Smith tells us, and he is still alive, were the 10-day women. A 10-day woman is a person who, having been drunk and disorderly, or been arrested as a common scold, is sentenced by the magistrate to 10 days or $10, and not having the $10 has to serve her 10 days in the workhouse. In lieu of this, she was, at one time, paroled, as it were, and allowed to serve 30 days in Bellevue as a nurse, provided she had any experience in family nursing. No wonder the poor of New York dreaded hospitals, and that dread still lives among them to some extent. Professor Draper was teaching at Bellevue, writing his book on the intellectual development of Europe, telling how unspeakably low the people were in the Middle Ages, yet he had no inkling at all that the medieval people had beautiful hospitals, some of the finest ever built, and magnificently trained nursing, and that they were doing surgery far ahead of any in his time. They were doing mighty little surgery at Bellevue in Dr. Draper's time, practically only emergency surgery, because the death rate was so high from septic complications that they dared not. In the medieval hospitals, they were doing operations for tumor and for abscess within the skull, and for all sorts of conditions within the abdomen. No surgeon at Bellevue in Draper's time would have dared to do such operations. They were wise, because their patients would have died. We have the textbooks of the Middle Ages describing these operations, and Draper knew nothing about them. He knew nothing about the intellectual development of Europe in his own profession. What possible worth can his opinions have with regard to the intellectual development of Europe in other departments, if he, a physician and a professor of medicine, was utterly ignorant even about the intellectual course of his own dearest interests in the olden times? I venture to say that if Draper had read some of these medieval surgical textbooks, anyone who wants to know anything about the subject can readily get hold of them, and if he had found details of descriptions of beautiful hospitals in the medieval times, he either would not have understood what they meant, or he would not have believed what they said. Our hospitals and surgery were so bad between 1860 and 1870 that to have heard that the medieval surgeons in medieval hospitals were getting union by first intention in wounds, the most favorable possible mode of healing, would have raised a laugh. It would have been literally incomprehensible. That very expression, union by first intention, would have seemed a myth in Draper's time. They knew almost nothing about it. They were deep in the delusion of laudable pus. Lord Lister brought us round to union by first intention again, and now when we read the accounts of the medieval surgeons, we know that they were anticipating our best work. I recently wrote for the Osler Memorial Volume, which was prepared for Sir William Osler's 70th birthday, an account of some of the surgery of the Crusades. Old Hugo of Lucca, who was on the Fourth Crusade, was one of the greatest surgeons of all times. He had the immense problem on his hands of caring for the hosts of wounded crusaders, and his heart was so deeply stirred that he succeeded in accomplishing results far ahead of his own time in saving life and securing the healing of wounds. His experience was written out by his son, who was a bishop, and came to be the foundation on which the great surgery of the great medieval universities was built up. We have the textbooks of Roger and Roland of Salerno, of Bruno of Longoburgo, of Theodoric, the son of Hugo of Lucca, of William of Salicet, of Lanfranc of Paris, of Henri de Mondeville, of Guy de Chauliac of Montpellier, of whom Malgardin in his History of Surgery said, "With the simple exception of Hippocrates, there is no treatise on surgery, Greek, Latin, or Arabic, which I place above or even on the same level with Chauliac's magnificent work. It is a masterpiece," he adds, "of learned and luminous writing." Of all this Dr. John Draper knew nothing, but Dr. Andrew White knew almost, if it were possible, less. Dr. White was the first president of a university in this country who was not a clergyman. His appointment and the non-sectarian policy of Cornell aroused great opposition among the Protestant clergymen of this country. President White got back at them by having his secretary gather together all the references that could be found anywhere in historical writing of any kind that could possibly be made to signify opposition between clergymen and scientists. He made a wonderful hodgepodge with some sense and a lot of nonsense in it. He suggested that the church forbade dissection just at the time when all the universities, though they were all under clerical control, began to practice dissection publicly. He said that the popes were very much opposed to the progress of medicine, though the list of the papal physicians, that is, the men who were chosen by the popes to be their personal attending physicians, represent the greatest list of names connected by any bond in the history of medicine. The papal physicians, for instance, are greater as a body than the list of any faculty of any medical school in the world. This was, of course, because the popes choose their physicians from the greatest men of each generation. Some of them come from Bologna, some from Padua, some from Naples, some from Montpellier, and as a consequence, their names represent a list unsurpassed in the original contributions made to medicine. When I pointed out some of these facts, President White wrote me and confessed that there had been a mistake made with regard to anatomy and medicine, but that he was now too old a man to go into the subject again, and that he hoped that the progress of the history of medicine would gradually set the whole subject right. And here is Brisbane quoting Draper and White as confidently as if their books were not long since out of date, and doing so in order to bolster up a theory of his by which apparently he hopes to foster disaffection between Christians and Jews. He declared in his editorial in the Boston Advertiser, which I suppose was published also in the various Hearst papers throughout the country, that Jewish physicians traveled all over the world, studied and wrote learnedly on medicine and other sciences when Christianity's only cure for disease was a miracle. Or, as he so editorially put it, while Christians taught that the first joint of the thumb was under the personal care of God, and other parts of the body supervised by other divine personages, Maimonides, Jewish physician to the Sultan Saladin in Egypt, was writing on poisons and antidotes. What nonsense a man can write when he thinks he knows something about a subject, but knows nothing about it, yet for that very reason is all the more ready to make confident assertions. There are a number of great Jewish physicians, but there is not a single century in the history of Christianity since the 5th, during which there have not been great Christian physicians, some of whose works have come down to us to show that men were thinking seriously about our medical problems, and often anticipating some of our best thoughts with regard to them. Dear Brisbane, do come out of the dark ages of the mid-19th century, when men, having the worst hospitals that ever were, the worst nursing ever thought of, the ugliest architecture ever imagined, when our American medical schools were granting a degree of Doctor of Medicine after 2 terms of 4 months each, and that degree was a license to practice medicine anywhere in the country, when the standards of our American universities were so low that no foreign university would recognize our degrees, when arts and crafts were almost unknown, when social conditions were the worst in history, we're calmly talking about the Middle Ages as Dark Ages. History has in recent years revealed to us the wonderful triumphs the medieval people made in all those matters in which we failed. Having no architecture, no painting worth talking about, no educational standards, ugly hospitals, and bad surgery, we actually could not appreciate what they were doing in the Middle Ages, and dared declare that they must be doing nothing because they were doing something so different from anything we were doing. Now we know better. We are imitating their architecture, humbly studying their painting, redeveloping their surgery, renewing their anesthesia, emulating their hospitals, and beginning to solve social problems as they did. It is time for men whose opinions are still in the dark ages of the benighted 19th century to wake up and learn something of all that has been revealed to us about the wonderful Middle Ages. End of section 4. End of Catholic and Anti-Catholic History by Various. Recorded by Jan Baker of the White Lily blog.